Good afternoon and welcome to today's session of True Normal. I'm Christelle Pansegrouw, I'm a director at VanderMerwe&Robertson attorneys. Please ask you to keep your video switched off and also mute your microphone during the session. However, feel free to ask questions during the session and just then remember to unmute your microphone. You can put on your video. We're also recording the session and we'll distribute it to all the participants, and also this will also be available on our website. In today's session, we're discussing the infodemic of disinformation around COVID-19. Our guest speaker today is Professor Herman Wasserman, a professor of media studies and director of the Center for Film and Media Studies at the University of Cape Town. He has researched and published extensively on misinformation and disinformation. He has been invited to deliver a keynote address at the World Health Organization's first infodemiology conference, which is currently taking place from 30 June to 16 July. This conference deals with the phenomenon of an infodemic. Professor Wasserman is also editor-in-chief of the journal African Journalism Studies, editor of the Annals of International Communication Association, and the author of several books. He has consulted for the United Nations and the Center for the International Media Assistance, has given keynote addresses and lectured at universities worldwide, including Stanford, Yale, and the London School of Economics and Political Science. His awards includes, amongst others, the George Vorster Prize for the German Alexander of Humboldt Foundation, the Fulbright Fellowship, the Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Research from University of Stellenbosch, the Nebel Prize for Journalism Theory from the University of St. Petersburg, and so we can go on. We thank you for making time out of your busy schedule just to share with us your work, insights, and experiences. Now I hand you over to Theo Vorster, the Director of Galileo Capital. Welcome also to you, Theo. Theo needs no introduction and he will facilitate the discussion this afternoon. Theo, thank you.
Christelle, Christelle,
yes.
Thank you very much. I really look forward to the discussion. Herman, we had a short discussion yesterday about the topic, and I think it is the importance of this topic is based around the fact that we are living in a world where we get bombarded with various sources of information, and everybody with anybody with a cell phone and a PC can put out statements, documents, either on Facebook or Twitter or wherever they want. And the challenge is, how does one operate in an environment where you get various sources of information on same topics on a continuous basis, almost bombarded to you from all sides? So I look forward to the discussion. So Herman, I hand it over to you. And I specifically want to try to view this in a way that we have got quite a number of questions that we will put to you as the discussion goes. But first of all, I'd like your comments and views on the world we live in, specifically pertaining to information and the overload of information.
Thank you, Theo and Christelle, and thank you everybody for listening in and for the invitation. It's really an honor for me to be speaking to you. I also want to say thanks for paying attention to this topic, to this issue. I think it's a really important issue that really affects all of us. I think by now you've all probably received a WhatsApp from your uncle, the so-called uncle with a PhD from WhatsApp University, or advising us of some home remedy to prevent COVID-19. Or maybe you've seen a Facebook post speculating that the virus was man-made and escaped a laboratory in China. We've seen in Europe, people have been destroying 5G cell phone masts because they believe it spreads the coronavirus. Here in Africa, we've seen in Madagascar claims of a herbal tonic. So these things around COVID-19, I think, have seen a sort of really a spate of sort of some egregious misinformation. But I think, as you mentioned, I think that the issue is much wider. I think it has to do with the change. So I think the World Health Organization has coined this notion of an infodemic. You said that accompanying this pandemic of COVID-19, we've also seen an infodemic of misinformation. And I think it's useful maybe to think about what do we mean by misinformation. So maybe give you a few definitions. I think the idea of fake news is probably the most popular term that we hear often, but the consensus now is rather to refer to it as either misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation. And that's a typology that UNESCO has suggested. So disinformation is information that is false and deliberately created to harm a person or a group or an organization or even a country. Some of it is imposter content. We've seen around the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen some of this disinformation where fake logos of the World Health Organization has been used to spread rumors or conspiracy theories, etc. You might have heard of deep fakes, these computer manipulated, created images of people. All of this is disinformation clearly intended to harm. But then there's also misinformation that might not be created with the intention of causing harm. It's more wrong context, for instance. Again, that picture that you might have received from people on the sidewalks purported to be people in Italy that didn't get space in the hospital, but in fact that's a photo from a few years ago where there was an earthquake, and people were sort of receiving treatment, but it's been recaptioned, it's been pulled from the original context, and it's circulating now. Or maybe that sort of rumor that you hear, I've heard from my cardiologist friend, in working in this hospital that X, Y, and Z. And that sort of misinformation, information that you might pass on, you're not intentionally trying to harm somebody, but it still contributes to this sort of infodemic. And then malinformation is information that might be based in reality, but that is shared also with the intention to inflict harm. So maybe email leaks before an election, or online harassment, hate speech, and so on. So I think it's just to keep that in the back of our minds, that we deal with lots of different types of information. And so the idea around fake news also is why people try to avoid that term, is because it's been weaponized by people like Donald Trump to dismiss and undermine legitimate news media. And as I'll say just a bit later, I think that mistrust in the media, or the attempts by politicians often to discredit the mainstream media, is part of the problem. We've seen in South Africa this problem. This is not the first time that we've seen it. We've seen misinformation for a number of years, fake websites that look like news sites, that even have a masthead that looks like Times Live, but then the I is a 1, so it's created to confuse you, and then it reports on Bishop Tutu's died, etc. But probably the most far-reaching disinformation campaign that you'd all be familiar with is the Bell Pottinger campaign, the White Monopoly Capital campaign that was orchestrated by Bell Pottinger, clearly aimed at deflecting criticism back away from former President Jacob Zuma and his implication in the state capture saga. So we've seen images of journalists like Ferrell Haffajee on Johan Rupert's lap, poorly photoshopped pictures that have been circulating. That was a clear disinformation campaign. But I think now, in the COVID-19 crisis, there's this perfect storm at the moment. To come back to Theo's comments about information overload, there's so much information coming at us from all sides. It is an unprecedented situation. It's a new virus. Even the medical profession and the scientists don't have all the answers yet. At the same time, these are also very uncertain times, economically uncertain. We might be anxious about our own health or people around us or loved ones. We're afraid, we're confused. And this whole environment creates this perfect environment for misinformation you can call it a host environment for this virus of misinformation. What happens then is also that people retreat to spaces of safety. When you're anxious, when you're uncertain, you retreat maybe to that little WhatsApp group of your community. Maybe it's your church, or maybe it's your neighbors or your family or friends. And those little bubbles, sometimes is referred to as filter bubbles or echo chambers. And they function to confirm your biases, really. You join and you participate in groups where your views are confirmed. Maybe your anxieties, maybe your skepticism. There's last few days, I've seen a lot of skepticism on Twitter, people, asking whether this is some sort of campaign by the government. There's questions asked around masks, etc. And these rumors circulate in these echo chambers where we hear what we want to hear and where our views aren't challenged. And it gives us a sense of comfort. It gives us a sense of familiarity. And it gives us that sort of sense that other people believe what we believe. And this is, I think, highly problematic, of course, in a situation like this where false information can be literally life-threatening. But it's also in a situation like this where even official information is not always clear. So we're not only overwhelmed with statistics and projections and figures and advice, but sometimes this information is also conflictual. The World Health Organization themselves initially said, well, you don't really have to wear a mask. It won't protect you. And now that advice has changed and we all are mandated to wear masks. So in this context where we see these sort of conflicting information, misinformation can clearly take root. Another part of the issue is as I've mentioned in the beginning, lack of trust often in mainstream news, or lack of trust in official sources of information like the government. What we've seen in the last number of months during this lockdown internationally is that there's been globally a surge of consumption of news media. There's been audiences have sought reliable information. They've all flocked largely to online news providers. But ironically, at the same time, as these audiences sought reliable information, overall levels of trust in the media are now at the lowest point ever. The Reuters Institute at Oxford just last week, I think, brought out a report, a digital news report, where they've surveyed people in 40 media markets around the world. And they found that fewer than 4 people in 10, so 38% of people say they trust news most of the time. So while they go to the news and while they consume it, they don't really trust it. And I think this information overload and this noise has contributed to that situation, the erosion of trust. That same study also found that 56% of people still don't know what information is real and what is fake. So a high percentage of people don't know what to trust. Research that I've been doing with colleagues here in several sub-Saharan Africa countries also show that there are a much higher level of perceived exposure to disinformation than even in the US. So what that means is that people tell us that they think they've been exposed to misinformation. We don't always, there's no way really of telling whether they had been, but they feel that way. And that's quite significant because it means that people don't know what to trust and what information is trustworthy or not. There's been similar studies. I won't bore you with all these studies and these latest statistics that have come out, but just in the US, briefly, I can maybe say that there's also around specific communities, like Black Americans have reported that they are skeptical of government interventions and the medical community. They've been feel that there's been a systemic failure the last number of years, or for many years, and that they would rather rely on community knowledge for their survival. So that means that people would rather trust information that their community or members of the family send them than official narratives. So what we also found in our own research in sub-Saharan Africa is that people would share misinformation willingly and knowingly. In other words, they would tell you, we asked them, have you ever sent something to a neighbor or a friend that you knew at the time was false? In other words, not something that you later found out. We asked that as well. But alarmingly high number of people say, we would share something even if we know that it is false. And that's, of course, highly problematic. So the question is then, why do people do it? What's the motivation? Why do people willingly and knowingly share this information? So there's several possible motivations. And internationally, there's been motivations, for instance, financial or political gain. So the Bell Pottinger campaign, for instance, clearly political gain, right? But on a more informal level, people would say, I do that to express my feelings. Somebody sends something, I may be anxious or afraid or confused, and I send on a message, and in that way I express my feelings, or I want to know what other people's opinions are. Other motivations that we find often is that people say that it helps me cope with my uncertainty, it helps me build relationships, and it creates a sort of social cohesion. So these sort of social and cultural motivations, I think, are quite important if we want to try and intervene. Maybe also just to say that in the sub-Saharan African context where we've done research, the most common reason for sharing misinformation has been a sort of misplaced sense of civic duty. So people would say, I'm sharing this to raise awareness because I've received this message that gargling with bicarbonate of soda might cure you from the coronavirus. I'm not sure if it's true. I actually doubt that it's true, but maybe it's my duty. Maybe I will save somebody's life. Let me share it in any case. So that sort of misplaced sense of civic duty plays a big role. And also sometimes, and this is where, and I think in the South African context where we've seen a lot of humor and joking around the coronavirus. In fact, I think the first responses to the first case in South Africa was jokes. You might have seen on Twitter and elsewhere people starting to joke. And as South Africans, we tend to do that. We tend to make fun of everything. It's a way of coping. It's a way of making light of maybe a very serious situation. The problem with that, of course, is that once these jokes start circulating, they add to this noise, they add to this environment where we don't always know what to trust. So what can we do about it? There are various forms of intervention. There are official and public authority interventions. We've seen our own government now have criminalized disinformation around COVID-19. That is, in my view, problematic, and many other people's views as well, because it can clamp down on freedom of expression. It can give government a tool to also stifle criticism and so on. But that's been clearly an attempt from the authorities to try and clamp down on this. We've seen platform responses where the media companies themselves, like WhatsApp and Twitter and so on, have been fact-checking. So it's in the news last few weeks where Twitter has fact-checked Donald Trump's statements about voting by mail, and that's been quite controversial. But the fact that Facebook doesn't want to do that, the fact that Facebook says they're not an arbiter in political disputes, has also now led to a lot of advertisers deserting Facebook. So there's a bit of a political and economic tussle around that, about what people think the responsibility of these platforms should be. But I think for our purposes here today, maybe to discuss in our own experience, is what is important is what's been called observational correction. So there's been quite a few studies done on the efficacy of people correcting their peers. In other words, you receive something, you receive a message, and instead of sharing it, you say, well, this looks fake to me. I have the skills and the tools to understand and to realize that this is not true, it's misinformation, and I'm not going to share it, and I'm also going to call out the person who sent it to me. So I think that is the first thing, is to really be skeptical of what you receive, be skeptical of what information you receive, always ask what's the evidence, on what is this based, and then corroborate what you've found. In other words, go to mainstream news organizations, see if this has been reported on by the journalists. This is not always foolproof, as we know. News 24 in this COVID crisis, I think there's an example of where they have also accidentally reported on vaccines that were purportedly tried out by Bill Gates, and they corrected it, and that was a systemic problem. But by and large, I think even if these systems aren't always foolproof, you have a much better chance of getting accurate information through established media. Ironically, I think now with the economic impact of COVID-19, we've also seen many independent media struggling and go under. And I think that's a problem. We don't only have to weed out bad information, we also have to promote good information. And that might mean in the future that we are going to pay much more for our news. We have to accept that much more of news will going to be subscription-based or behind paywalls, etc. And then two other things, maybe just in closing, is to say that what you can also do is think about when you correct people, when you call people out, not to shame them necessarily. I think what happens then is that people would just say, well, I'm going to retreat to that little filter bubble, that echo chamber where people believe me and where they share my biases. But instead, maybe tell your uncle Uncle, I know you are concerned about this virus. I am anxious about it as well. But that information that you sent might be harmful. There's no evidence for it. So let's rather follow medical advice. So try and meet people where they are, try and find out why people are anxious, why people are sharing this. And I think that's why our research in motivations, in my view, is quite important, to try and find out why people do what they do. And lastly, I think media literacy is also an important intervention, to equip yourself with the tools of doing a reverse image search on Google, for instance. If you get something posted on your Facebook page by a friend or family member and it looks dodgy, do a Google image search and find out where that might have originated from. If something seems shocking or too good to be true, it often is. There's also some campaigns internationally to do more of this media literacy in our schools, and I think that's also an important area that we haven't developed enough yet in South Africa, is to do media literacy and media literacy campaigns in schools. Social media, of course, plays a huge role in our kids' lives, and I don't know whether they're always well enough equipped to sort fact from fiction in that area. So there are many ways in which we can try and resist this infodemic, and where we can educate ourselves. But I think what we have to realize is that it's not only the responsibility of platforms, it's not only the responsibility of the authorities, but it's all of our responsibility. So thanks very much. I look forward to interesting questions.
Herman, thank you very much. That was really enlightening. We've got quite a number of questions, but I'm going to ask you first a question from my side. What for me is very interesting is if I look at the way that the media, politicians, business people are reacting and looking for facts and certainty, and I look at the way that proper medical professionals and medical doctors and scientists are reacting, there's almost a humility in terms of the science and scientific people's reactions. Whereas the media and politicians want answers, they want a date and they want a number and they want a model. And the scientists are telling us, but that's difficult. What do we read in that? Because for me, it is just interesting, the difference between somebody trying to make an arrogant prediction and usually the scientists say, wait a minute, what do you make of that?
I think that's a really important observation. As you know, that in the world of academia and research, we work on the basis of peer review. And that peer review takes a long time. Similarly with vaccines at the moment, there's this urgency, of wanting to create a vaccine, wanting to roll it out. But, the scientists and the health authorities are telling us, be patient, it has to go through clinical trials. And, I think at the moment, what we have to learn to live with is this uncertainty. And I think that uncertainty is also important because it leads us to question instead of accepting too easily. I think skepticism and uncertainty are really important virtues at the moment. But yes, I think we also have to be very aware of how this very uncertainty is being hijacked by political agendas. I get the sense that there's a contrarian narrative emerging in South Africa where this uncertainty is used as a sort of stick to hit government with. So regardless of your own political views, I think, you have to be skeptical of how people use this information, or maybe how people use this lack of information for political ends. And I think when that expediency comes into play, and when that rush to easy answers come into play, especially in a very uncertain situation like this, I think we have to be skeptical. But of course, that's how misinformation also works, and that's how it becomes successful, because it gives people false assurances. It creates a sort of false comfort zone, and in a time where people are anxious, that's what they will cling to.
Yeah, it is. I think people are not what we have. I think what we've seen and what I've read is just how uncomfortable uncertainty makes people, and that most of us cannot really operate when there's too much uncertainty. we've got quite a number of questions, and Henry, can I ask you to start putting the questions on the screen if possible, and we can go through them, because there is quite a number of questions, and I think some of them are very detailed and very pertinent. So if we can start with a question, it's this, and I just want to close my screen so that I can actually follow this. In the task of streaming accurate COVID-19 information, what has been considered can be included in age-appropriate online resources? And I think number one, the question relates to the reduced potential for stigmatization, which unfortunately there's quite a bit of social media around that, and include what can be done to mitigate the lack of human physical context experienced by learners. So this is kind of linked towards the younger generation and how one should.
Yes, thanks very much. That's an interesting question. I'm also glad that you started with the point about uncertainty and that we don't always know the answers, because I don't know all the answers to this one. It is a question that also goes to the psychology of learners, of young people. There's been some information coming out on how adversely, for instance, teenagers are being affected by lockdown and not being able to mix socially. I mean, that's not my field of expertise, but I think in terms of social media use and online resources, what has been useful in the last number of days have been public figures that come out and say, listen, I tested positive. It takes us back almost to the days of the HIV pandemic as well, where if you recall, the TAC had these T-shirts printed that just said HIV positive. I think, you know, these attempts are ways of undermining that stigmatization, because stigmatization here is really problematic as well, because if you are stigmatized, you are less likely to disclose your status to others, and you might not participate to comply with social distancing, etc., because you might be afraid of being found out in that sense. So I think this is where social media might play a good role, is to facilitate that sort of discussion around it, to say, listen, I've tested positive, this is how I'm feeling, be careful out there. But in terms of mitigating the lack of human physical contact experienced by learners, I can't really comment on sort of that sort of, let's say, educational psychology dimension of it. But I think what we've seen is also that all these platforms like the Zoom one that we're using at the moment, and Microsoft Teams and these applications, to some extent mitigate that. To some extent, you know, people are creative and they have sorts of social gatherings around this, but it's not the same. And and I think we have to be aware of the way that this is affecting us and our children, and maybe just watch out for those sort of signals, and where it might have detrimental impact on young people, also seek professional help maybe.
Thank you. Henry, can we have the second question?
Yes, I think,
for the question.
do you want to read it?
In the meantime, if you look at, from your point of view, Herman, if you look at the sources, what is the key sources? But all right, let's come back here. If you consider the immense pressure that the media has been under in the past few months while reporting on the fast-changing, complex situation with limited resources, should we, as the public, as a rule, always be skeptical? And then the question poses a kind of a answer to this. I think the message is to be positively suspicious. But surely it is counterproductive to society not to trust anyone. Now, that's a kind of a mouthful. Your comments?
Look, I think what this question points to is that the media are fallible. So we have to be critical of that. All the self-regulatory measures that we have in this country, the Press Council, the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa, those are self-regulatory systems that recognize that the media are fallible, but they're also geared to give us as a public the opportunity to complain about the media. So we should take responsibility as media consumers, media users, to, if something looks false or suspicious, or we think it's stereotyping or whatever, we can make use of these platforms. But in the context of misinformation, I would say rather trust the mainstream media than something that you received on WhatsApp. The chances are that what you've seen on News 24 or in some newspaper or some established news organization has been fact-checked. They would probably have checked out their sources if they were worth their salt as journalists, and rather corroborate and maybe then corroborate different media as well. If you receive a report in your local community newspaper or even online like News 24, and it looks suspicious, corroborate it with other evidence. But I think that sort of positive aspect of saying, listen, I can see this is wrong and I will participate in the regulatory process by taking it to press council or whatever. That's something different than a sort of very generalized mistrust. I think that sort of generalized mistrust is problematic because that does give rise to a sort of anything goes. With this, I think 2 years ago, the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year was that we live in the so-called post-truth society, where people think there isn't something like the truth anymore. When something becomes as relativistic as that, I think we're in trouble. There are consensual truths around things like COVID-19. There are consensual facts, and try and establish what those are.
Henry, if you can put the third question on, please. If you look at South Africa as a nation, how do you think we have as a nation responded to the spread of false information? And how do we protect the truth? I think some of it has been answered. Perhaps just a comment on that.
Let me maybe backtrack a little bit also to the Bell Pottinger case. If you recall, that narrative of white monopoly capital that was inserted into our Twitter sphere and social media sphere was very cleverly designed because it tapped into our highly polarized, highly unequal society, and it also really fed on people's sense often that the society hasn't transformed enough. But the positive thing about that is that there was also this self-correction going on. There was on our mainstream media, there was a investigative journalism into state capture and also into the Bell Pottinger scandal itself. There were, I think, News 24, Daily Maverick, and a few others teamed up, and they exposed this, and it brought that mighty company to a fall. So I think we can also be proud of the way that our investigative journalism in the last number of years have managed to expose these misinformation campaigns. But I must say that maybe to get back to the specific question, how we have responded now, I am slightly concerned that I am seeing again this sort of polarization where people are becoming more disgruntled, they're becoming fearful. A lot of people have maybe lost their jobs, their income, etc. And this leads to this sort of polarization and anger and outrage culture on social media specifically. So I think that's something to watch out for, and to recognize that this misinformation feeds on our inequalities. It feeds on our fears, on our biases, etc. So when you receive something that makes you angry, if your first response is to become angry or to be outraged, you maybe have to ask, why am I getting angry? And maybe this is the response that this information wanted to elicit from me. And is something else behind this. So I think that's something that, especially in a highly unequal, polarized country like ours, where we have this history of racial tension, of economic inequalities, etc., we have to be very careful of how we respond to this messages.
Thank you. Henry, can we have is there more questions? Okay, this is a very long one. I'm using the property market as an example of this question. There are so much information, statistics, opinions given on various platforms regarding property prices that will drop. There will be no movement. Banks will not approve any further loans. But as we have nothing to compare this current situation with, that we find ourselves in, no history to go back to or compare, uncharted waters, as we have heard so many times that we find us in, what can we do to ensure that the information put out there does not start to regulate property prices? Now, clearly this is somebody in the property market that's concerned that if you tell a story enough times, it might just become the truth, although there was no basis for it. Your comment, Herman?
Yes, look, we know that markets work on sentiment, and that whether it's the property market or the stock market, sentiment plays a huge role. We've seen this now in the last few weeks in the US stock market, where as soon as there is a rise in sentiment, or also fiscal stimuli, etc. But I mean, when there's a rise in sentiment, when there's a report coming of a vaccination that's imminent or whatever, then we see this rise. And the same will be, I think, probably applicable to the property market, that sentiment drives these markets. I think the thing to realize now is that nobody knows. Nobody has clear answers. If somebody offers you a very clear-cut answer, I think the first response would be to say, well, what's the evidence for this? There's a lot of speculation, and there's not inherently something wrong with speculation or with projections. We see this often where people will say, well, we expect the economy to contract with so much. It's not necessarily a baseless speculation, that's a projection. Similarly, with projections around infection figures, death figures, etc., these are often projections that are based in research and based in empirical evidence. But I think we have to ask that question: on what basis are you making this claim? What evidence do you have for this claim? And then also maybe what is your personal stake in making this claim? Do you have a personal stake in projection, in some sort of projection, and have you declared that interest? I think that is important to ask those questions. So yeah, be skeptical, ask where the evidence is, and ask what people might stand to gain from making certain claims, but also realize that we are in a highly uncertain situation, and that speculation is rife.
I'm going to allow one more written question. So if there's one more question, Henry, do you have a last question? Then I'm going to ask if there's anybody that would like to ask a question. There we are. That is 3 questions. That's perhaps what are trustworthy to-go sources of information regarding COVID-19? Perhaps that needs a bit of homework. How can I verify the source of information that I read? And do you have some tips and resources for us that everyone can combat the spread of false information? Now, I think we've covered a lot of this, but just some comments on the specific questions raised here.
Yeah, thanks. I think these are important questions. So in terms of the trustworthy go-to sources of information regarding COVID-19, I would say, as a first port of call, go to established news outlets, but also corroborate them. One outlet might not have all the answers or might get it wrong, so corroborate and read widely, read as much as you can. But we are dealing with an epidemic or a pandemic that requires really subject-specific expertise, and these are the epidemiologists, these are the scientists. So I think in terms of the pandemic itself, in terms of the virus, in terms of the transmission, etc., go to the source, and I would go to the health authorities, the Department of Health, and internationally there are these bodies, the World Health Organization, the Center for Disease and Communicable Diseases, and so on. So go to the trustworthy sources of scientific information, and try and establish and trying to corroborate and try and find as much information as you can. How can I verify the source of information that I read? I'm assuming that pertains to information that you might get through informal channels like WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever. And there are really, and that also maybe take the third question with that, tips and resources. There are really some good sites on the internet where you can really acquire these skills. So one place where I would recommend you to go is Africa Check. The South African fact-checking organization, Africa Check. There's also around the elections last year, there was one, the real911.org. I can maybe afterwards share some of this on the group if you want and can circulate it, but I would go to Africa Check or the Real 911 in South Africa. The Media Monitoring Project, for instance, there's First Draft. There are quite a number of these fact-checking organizations that have these tips and resources that you can teach yourself and teach your kids, for instance, and say, this is how we can establish the veracity of a website, for instance, or this is how we can do a reverse Google image search. And these are really not difficult things to do. You don't have to be a data scientist to do this. And these are really just sort of basic skills that on those websites you can find practical tips. So go to Africa Check, I think, as a first port of call.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to take more written questions because we are running kind of out of time. Perhaps just if there's anybody that would like to ask a specific question that's on the line, I will allow 1 or 2 questions. We are nearly 45 minutes in, so I will allow 1 or 2 questions. Is there anybody with a specific question that they would like to put to Herman? Remember to unmute if you have a specific question. Well, I think we have we've gone through the written questions, Herman, and from my point of view, I would like to thank you, to say thank you for your time, thank you for the insights. Unfortunately, I think we're going to be with this for quite a while, but at least one last question that for me is quite bothersome, and that is that if we look at social media, if we look at various medias, the question, and perhaps this is more of a long-term question, but how are the models going to look in future to pay for a newsroom, to pay for proper investigative journalism, to make sure that the news that we get is reliable, because you get a lot of news for free, the quality is not that good, and how are we going to pay for the newsroom of the future?
Thanks, Theo. I think that's a really important question. We've seen in this, only in this last few months, well, let me backtrack again, a little bit bigger picture is that the whole shift to the digital ecology has collapsed the traditional business models. The traditional business models of the news media have been, you charge very little for your newspaper that gets delivered. What is sold to you is not, it's not the newspaper that gets sold to you, you are sold to the advertisers. In other words, that, you know, advertising basis. That has changed radically, and the online environment has not been monetized to the same extent as these older models have been. Add to that now the economic impact of COVID-19, where we've seen, especially print media, we've seen a number of magazines already closing in South Africa. Print media are under huge pressure. Small independent local publishers are decimated. The South African National Editors Forum just today announced an emergency relief fund for journalists that have lost their jobs. So it is a real economic crisis for the news media. What this means is that we will probably have to pay for news that we consume. So we have to get ready to pay for authoritative news, whether that be through a subscription or a paywall where you pay to read a specific story, or you might get a few stories free. There are various models of pay as you go. There are other models where you become a member of a site. The Daily Maverick already has that. You can read most of the media, most of the content for free, but if you're a Maverick insider, you pay a small subscription fee, you get first dibs on some of the investigations and so on. So that's another model. A third model is the donor-funded model, and that's where a news site like groundup.org, if you're not familiar, or ZA Groundup, if you're not familiar with them, I would really strongly recommend them. They work on donations, and that makes their work possible. So they provide the news for free, but they work with donations. So that's another model that Bekesisa, for instance, maybe it's good that I just remembered Bekesisa. Bekesisa is the health journalism website that originally was part of the Mail and Guardian and now is independent. Mia Malan is their editor. If you want to read really good health journalism, go into Bekesisa. It's a fantastic resource. But they as well, they work on donation. So that's yet another model. So somebody's got to pay for quality news. It might be you as the end consumer. It might be a donor. Or you might have to subscribe, but I think that's the model that we will have to get used to get quality news. And unfortunately, I think a lot of smaller players are probably going to not make this, not survive this pandemic, and that's a pity because it dilutes the number of voices in society, different perspectives, and I think that is a problem, especially in a very plural society such as ours, but that's the reality.
I think some point that we also, something that we have to just recognize is the truly exceptional job or task that the investigative journalists did in the last 3, 4, 5 years. Because if you look at almost the dismal failure of the official prosecuting authorities, of the investigative state resources, if it wasn't for a handful of very dedicated journalists, a lot of this, including Bell Pottinger, would have stayed with us for much longer.
Absolutely. I think with all the criticism, and this our right and our responsibility as media consumers to remain critical and also keep journalists to account, we shouldn't become cynical. I think we have to, as you say, appreciate the really important work that has been done around state capture, around Bell Pottinger, around many of these large problems. So the problem, of course, is that whether that leads to, as you say, prosecutions, whether there's some response, we might start to see some of it now, hopefully. But yes, I think that has been really, really important, and we should support that.
Well, on that note, yeah. On that note, Professor Herman Wasserman, thank you very much for your time. I think it was truly informative, and I think it's a subject matter that, given the new world, we should focus a lot more, and we should make sure that we become specialists in this, and assist our friends and family and even children to distinguish between what they can rely on and what they should not rely on. And specifically, don't take anything for granted. Don't believe anything you hear or read. But thank you very much. It was a real pleasure, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. I just want to end off by last time when we talked about politics, there was a number of questions about the governing party's Congress. So I just want to share it with you because we had quite a number of comebacks on it. If we look at the NEC meeting that happened Monday or Tuesday, and I'm specifically going to look at the elements that was decided that might have an economic impact. So this is not the social impact. This is not the politics. This was some of the economic matters that was noted specifically by the NEC in their meeting. And first of all, what they did say is, and what is important, is that they clearly said, and I didn't note here that they expressed the condition regarding alcohol, but they also said that the alcohol ban is not going to come back. But what they did say is, clearly the ANC's NEC believe that they should look at the basic income grant. Now, where did this come from? As you know, that apart from all the other grants, there was also a 350 Rand grant provided for people that does not fall under any of the elements. Well, the National Executive Committee resolved that they should look at the feasibility and the detailed modalities of a basic income grant. Just a point, this will become a worldwide debate. What it is that every single citizen in the country gets an amount of money every month. If you earn $1 million or if you're unemployed, you get your first, in South Africa in this case, they're looking at something like 350 Rand per month. So everybody gets that as a starting point. It is something that was not on the table 6 months ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but that is a principle that the NEC wants to look at. Secondly, on the economic side, they specifically said that they will look at economic intervention measures within the framework of reconstruction, growth, and transformation, but there's two pillars to that. The first pillar is to mobilize the society around infrastructure-led recovery. And those details are quite wide because it includes things like education, health, spectrum, bandwidth, but the one leg is infrastructure-led recovery, and the other point, the other principle is key investment in key productive areas. And there the governing party specifically highlighted 4 industries: agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and tourism. Now, what for me was very interesting was what they added to this. And they added to this that in order to get these 2 avenues, these 2 legs, these 2 principles, that will need to require a combination of public and private resources. We more and more in the last 6 to 9 months seeing this principle of private resources coming back into government policy, which technically is a good thing because in the Zuma years it was not there, it wasn't regarded. Then The ANC specifically made the following commitment. There should be changes made to Regulation 28 under the Pension Funds Act, and listen to this, to enable cheaper access to finance for development. Now, Regulation 28 in the Pension Funds Act is the regulation that determines where and how you can invest. It's got certain requirements as to you can only invest 30% of a pension fund overseas. Your equity exposure can only be a specific amount. But the key, what they are looking here apparently, is you're very limited in terms of what they call non-traditional investments, what they say as alternative investments. And the view here is that if you increase that space, you will allow pension funds to take part in developmental finance, to come back to combination of public and private resources. That's what they're after. The question is, will it be voluntary? That means, will the custodians or the trustees of the pension fund be in a position to make a risk-based decision when they invest in these products? Or are they going to be a kind of a prescription? Remember, in the old National Party government, we have prescribed assets. That means you had to invest in certain elements. At this point in time, they resolved that there should be changes to Regulation 28. One hope it's not forced. Then what they also noted is that they said about the SOEs, they're happy with the ongoing work, but then they added this. They welcomes the search for equity partners, and they added private sector participation. Now, I don't want to use the P word, because once you use the P word, you're in big trouble. So I'm not going to use the privatization word. But this is nothing more than the search for equity partners, including private sector participants. This means that their view might have changed on the long-term future of SOEs. Again, this was specifically the elements decided by the NEC Monday and Tuesday, or Sunday and Monday. So I think one needs to, if we look at where government's thinking is, these is elements that one should look at. But that, from my point of view, is a few last comments. I think that's elements we should look carefully about. So from my point of view, I would like to say to everybody, I hope you have a great evening. I hope you have a great week. We will be back next Thursday. And lastly, Professor Herman Wasserman, thank you very much. It was a truly great discussion, and all the best. We hope in 6 or 12 or 18 months' time we can talk again, and we look back and we see what lessons we learned. So from my point of view, everybody, thank you for your participation. This it's recorded. It will be mailed to everybody, and at leisure you can look at it again or send it to anybody. But from my point of view, thank you very much. I'm signing off now. All the best, guys.